Hey YouTubers, Strasbourg 1991 Productions here. Nicholas Medovich with Strasbourg 1991 Productions here. Back with another book haul idea, part 2. As I mentioned to Josh Caporelli, Ari Schneider-Gams, and Corporation and Company or so, I actually found some new ideas that I actually found. This is going to be very unique. I have a brand new science nonfiction, pretty much. I actually have a couple of book ideas that I think would be interesting. It's about, internal combustion, engineering. There was actually a few of them, and a few astronomy ideas that I'd like to mention. I'm just going to give out one of every type of transportation, so I'm going to be quick and smart on this. The first one is on airplanes. I actually found a few of this was a book called my first title is it's a very heroic emotional book. It's about, this one is called Fairbanks Failure, and if you don't know what the book Fairbanks Failure is about, this is about the tragic story on Alaskan Airlines Flight 261 in 2000 on January 31st, I believe. The plane actually had a very critical, actually fatal malfunctional flaws. The parts on the flight were not even lubricated. They were basically the parts that were not greased. They were pretty much ran high and dry when they had an altitude of a little over 6,782 some feet up in the air. I actually found a very unfortunate. What happened is that I think it was either McDowell Douglas, hence the term MD. It was either an MD-80 or an MD-85, one of those two serial numbers. But the story was about the people. Most of the people actually survived the crash, but they all perished after what happened after the crash. Most of them either drowned by, most of them passed away. They perished by drowning and or hypothermia because of the cold temperatures that were freezing near as they were taking off the Pacific coast. It's a very emotional story. There was also a similar story. It was called Rock and Roll Catastrophe. Now this was about Flight 1420 in Little Rock. It was basically an MD-80, and what happened was when the pilot had very bad communicational difficulties, the connections were so poor you couldn't even hear the radio warnings come from the radio and the microphones. You couldn't even hear them. But it actually happened, and the pilots did they actually reach the pilots? Those pilots they were warned previously of bad weather, but because of a terrible lightning that basically killed the connection, the communication was pretty much dead as it crash landed. The only person who sadly was killed was the pilot himself. Unknown what happened on 1420. It was back in 1999. They did a story with Bob Orr as the aviation correspondent for CBS Evening News in the Washington Bureau. So there was actually another form of transportation, astronomy. I actually found out the Delta III rockets, and I actually found a very good astronomy book. It was called Visiting Voyager. Now, this is basically a true story about that satellite launched back in February of 1991 towards Neptune's orbit, and the idea was actually presented by astronaut Alan Shepard, who wanted to do studies on Neptune's orbit because Pluto was basically 52 miles from connecting with Neptune's orbit. It was a very unusual story. They actually found that Pluto was actually in Neptune's orbit, and they was trying to get to another part outside the orbit, but the story doesn't really demonstrate, you know, anything about Pluto being interfering in Neptune's orbit. It just, they did the studying of what would happen if Pluto was in Neptune's orbit, but that was back in 91. Alan Shepard was the first person who came up with, who did some research in the NASA controls standards. It's a very interesting story about how Voyager became a very global icon in astronomy. And now let's go back, and now we go to another form of transportation, the semis of all over, whether it's 2-axle, whether it's 4-axle, 6-axle, 7-axle, 8-axle. Even the highest I think was maybe a 14 or a 15 or a 16-axle for mostly super heavy loads. But there's actually called Denton's Gate. Is basically, it's about the construction of big rig vehicles assembly in the state of Texas, and they hauled the largest loads through countries from like Australia. They had the road trains, which were basically 36-axle semis, which are only in Australia to begin with. Then you have the big rigs, which are the 18-wheelers, are usually 6-axle, either Kenworth or Freightliners, whichever they choose. And they actually have a few unknown double trailers, which are basically 7 or 8-axle. And I've actually seen few that go up to 9 and 10 to 12-axle. So, and there's also a triple axle that I think was, there's like a 15 or I think there was a 17-axle. So you might want to find that very interesting. And it features all corporations, J.B. Hunt, even a few gasoline like Texaco, Sunoco, Texagon, and there could be a lot more. Mobil, Amoco was the one, that was the name, Amoco, and then there was a few Shell, and I think there was also a, I'm trying to remember the other corporations, but I think that's all I can think of right now. But it's still, nonetheless, I mean, it was just very unique about the papers and axles and speeds and everything else. And the last vehicle that I was actually going to mention, and also featured dump trucks and garbage trucks as well. They all fit in the same category. Moving van, which are basically truck container sized, so they all go in the same category. The last one, obviously, is basically, it's called General Purpose for a Special Duty. It's basically training centers on how to be a locomotive engineer, whether it's a 4-axle, meaning general purpose, or a special duty, meaning 6-axle. I mean, this not only goes for electromotive division, but it also goes to General Electrics. The B, C's are the 4 and 6 axles. Rebuilds, high hood, low nosed, and the double diesels from the Union Pacific from 1971, built in '69. They were also in the 6900s because of the 100th year of transcontinental passenger service on every railroad history in the world. I actually got a few very unique books that I was planning on searching, although the copies are long out of print. But I did actually find there was one of the books. It was actually called cataloged. It was cataloged, but it wasn't really sold. It was called A Catalog for Change, and it was basically, this was about a story about, I believe it was basically steam locomotives that were blueprinted, but they were never delivered. There were actually a few others, including some crazy locomotives like the 414 4s, which were the actual, there were steam locomotives that were basically built for the Soviet Union, but they've been scrapped ever since. They were some of the rarest locomotives ever in history. They basically had 14 coupled driving wheels, the big wheels that powered the locomotive. And the largest surviving non-articulated are the 9000 series locomotives for the Union Pacific, with 12 couple driving wheels. The only reason I did not include the 9000s is because the 9000s were actually 3-cylinder engines, meaning an extra cylinder was injected in between the locomotive's first and second pair of driving wheels. And the maintaining of the frame was just an absolute nightmare, and they only could do flat, straight track at maybe 40 miles per hour, no harder, no smoother. But in mountainous countries where heavy curvature is prominent, they would basically stop because the driving wheels would basically pop off the rails because the framework is so long, you couldn't even fit a locomotive under frame without starting to crack the bolts or rivets from the sections. And that's how the Challengers and Big Boys and the Malays basically took over the long, hilly portions on the Union Pacific Railroad. But I actually did find there was also one other book that I found was very interesting. There was actually a history of the duplex locomotives for the Pennsylvania post-war production. And this basically goes to the top 5 locomotives that were tested experimental, from 5 being the absolute worst to 1 being the absolute best. And the top 5 in order were as follows: the Q1, S2, S1, Q2, and the T1. Actually, T1 and the Q2. Q2 was the most successful. 4464, 4444 T1s, 6446 in Pennsylvania. The S2, which was a very disappointing because they put the pressure at 350, which would crack every portion of the staybolt. And the Q1, which basically had poor construction of they had the cylinders way too close, almost like between clock points. Like the cylinders were located underneath the section of the firebox, which would cause problems. So they've been all scrapped since the 50s, but it shows you the illustration of Pennsylvania's triumphs and tragedies, like trials and errors, pretty much. Hopefully I'll hear back for part 3 of my ideas. This is just a variety, because there have been histories of, whether it's Raymond Loewy, Henry Dreyfuss, Fred Harvey, John Henry Casey Jones, all the railroad legends, Elijah McCoy, O. Winston Link, Jim Wren, and so many others that I'll be programming later on in this broadcast. Thank you so much for watching. Nicholas Matovich for Strasburg 1991 Productions. Hope to see you soon. I'll see you down the line. Bye.